back to the auto-contouring review. In this video we'll be looking at a paper titled External Validation of Deep Learning Based Contouring of Head and Neck Organs at Risk by Ellen Brunenberg. And later on in the video we'll be talking to Ellen to get her insights on this paper. So what's this paper about? Essentially this paper takes a step in the direction of answering the question, does each institution need to train their own deep learning contouring model to assist with automatic organs at risk segmentation? Imagine the situation where you have 3 hospitals. Each of these hospitals purports to follow the same international consensus guidelines for contouring. As a consequence of that, each hospital has a large database of previous patients that have been contoured according to these standards. And if they wanted to, each of the hospitals could go and train their own deep learning contouring model to assist with automatic organs at risk segmentation. But if all these hospitals contour to the same standard, it should be possible to take a model from one institution and give it to another institution and find that that model is essentially the same as their model, or it would be good enough for use on their patients. If this isn't the case, that might suggest that the different hospitals are somehow doing something differently with respect to contouring. And as a consequence, it might be necessary for each hospital to train their own model to really improve the efficiency of automatic segmentation. So how did Ellen and the team go about looking into this? In a previous study, University Medical Center Groningen, or UMCG, had taken a database of 549 patients and used that to build a deep learning contouring model for the head and neck. And they had subsequently validated this on 104 independent test patients. In this piece of research, at Radboud University Medical Center, they took that model, developed by Groningen, and applied it on a test set of 58 patients taken from their internal database of patients and contoured by their own clinicians. And they did a quantitative analysis to see how well that model was performing. To also look at any differences in contouring standards, they took 20 patients from the Groningen set, which had both been contoured manually by the Groningen clinicians and automatically using the DLC model, and asked the Radboud clinicians to visually inspect these using a web-based tool to assess whether they were clinically acceptable, whether they would need editing, and determine whether they preferred them, either the manual or the deep learning, and whether they could identify the source of the contours. So what did they find? In terms of quantitative assessment, they found good performance for the salivary glands overall, and for the brainstem and mandible. However, for the aerodigestive tract, with the exception of the oral cavity, they found moderate to poor performance. But this doesn't give us any indication of whether it's something to do with the model, or something to do with the reference by which the model is being assessed. To understand that, we need to look at the performance that UMCG found with that same model. And this is presented in the paper in a table, where one column shows the benchmark, the performance that UMCG have found in terms of dice score, and the next column shows the results found on the cohort from Radboud. And for those salivary glands, the performance was good both at Radboud and UMCG. Whereas for some of the organs in the aerodigestive tract, there's a marked decrease in performance when assessed using the Radboud data. However, the model hasn't changed. This is purely a matter of the data and the reference contour that's being used to assess it. So it might be thought that maybe there's a difference in interpretation. And this is where the paper gets interesting and perhaps hard to interpret. The results of the subjective assessment showed that the Radboud observers accepted the manual contours drawn by the Groningen clinicians more than the Groningen clinicians did themselves. Conversely, the Radboud observers rejected the DLC contours more frequently than the UMCG observers were rejecting those contours. And this suggests perhaps that the contouring standards are somehow the same, but the way that they're judging the contours varies, and doesn't entirely tally with the quantitative results seen in the paper. And this is an area that's discussed in some depth in the paper. Let's now talk to Ellen to see what she has to say about the findings in this paper.
Hi Ellen, thanks for joining me today. To start off with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what your role is currently, just to give some background to yourself?
Sure, hi Mark. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Ellen Brunenberg and I'm a medical physicist at the Radiation Oncology department of the Radboud UMC in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. As a medical physicist, I manage our MR-Linac project at the moment, and I work on pre-treatment imaging and image registration. So in that role, I've collaborated with Murada for a couple of years now.
Great, thanks for that. So we're looking at the paper about the external validation of deep learning contouring, where you've taken a model developed by another institution and validated it in your institution. Why do you feel somebody should go away and read this paper? What's important about this paper?
Good question. I think there's more and more interest and also more and more publications about AI and deep learning contouring and radiotherapy or all other uses of deep learning. And it's not so difficult anymore to create a model or have it created from a data set that's coming from your own clinic. But I think, yeah, first you need to have the technical resources to do it. And not everyone has those. And we wanted to see what happens if you take a model based on another set of data that use the same delineation guidelines. And I think regardless of the source of the model, you need to be able also to implement the model into the clinic and make sure that the clinicians accept the results. And we see that there are a lot of more factors to that than just the geometric performance. So I think, yeah, the preliminary subjective evaluation that we added also shows these factors and, yeah, opens a lot of questions for follow-up research, actually.
I guess also there's the motivation there that if everyone develops their own model, then we diverge in what we're contouring potentially. You sort of reinforce institutional differences, whereas by doing this validation, you can hope perhaps to improve standardization across clinics.
Yeah, so I think indeed you see the effort to have the same delineation guidelines, which has been performed really nicely for the head and neck region. So it should be possible, in my view, to have the same deep learning model then as well. So yeah.
Yeah. But despite that, for some organs, we found quite a difference between the model developed by Groningen and what you then measured at Radboud. What do you think the most likely cause of those differences are?
I think there are some likely causes. Most important might be the resolution of the planning CT that was used, or the imaging protocol. So in Nijmegen, for example, we used 3mm slices for the planning CT, while the model has been developed with 2mm CTs. And I think in the head and neck region with a lot of small structures, this difference in resolution might play an important role. And this also seems to be indicated by the results of the local dice coefficient evaluation, I think, which shows that the most caudal and cranial bins show the largest deviations. And I think in addition, the references for comparison differed. So in Groningen, they used manual delineation that were curated and in addition based already on atlas-based delineations. Well, in Nijmegen, we used the clinical delineations without any curation, so that might be also a cause of difference.
So I guess, yeah, we've got the challenge that we're trying to judge stuff against a reference, which itself is different. Yeah. And to some extent, the subjective evaluation, which I've referred to as a sort of modified Turing test that you've done in this paper, is there to overcome that, rather than looking at an absolute gold standard against which you're judging contours. You're you're just asking whether it's acceptable, which therefore does it mitigates differences in a reference. But you see quite a difference actually between the Radboud observations and the Groningen. Particularly, I thought it was really interesting to see that the Radboud observers seem about 10% more willing to accept the manual contours from Groningen and about 10% less willing to accept the DLC contours. Have you got any thoughts on that? To where that difference comes from?
I think the DLC part might be the easiest to explain, because in Groningen they have used this contouring model for a while now, and they're used to curating and editing the contours, while in Nijmegen it was completely new for the observers. So probably it's a learning curve problem, and they have to get used to the fact that they don't have to edit every little millimeter of the model's results. And I think, yeah, the manual delineation, it's a bit more surprising from my point of view, as the delineation guidelines that were used are the same. It might be a small group size effect. So I think in Groningen more observers were used, so I would expect more of a variability. Maybe we were lucky with an accepting observer in Nijmegen, I don't know.
I found that particularly interesting. On previous studies we've done looking at Atlas contour, and we found observers from other institutions tended to reject contours more from a different institution, where here they're more willing to accept them. Perhaps people at Groningen are just a little bit more judgmental of their own work. You're a kind of bunch in Radboud.
Yeah.
I think one aspect that struck me, sort of looking through the results again, you've done this nice breakdown of the dice scores sort of regionally, it's sort of in the axial direction, and the performance is bad at the cranial and caudal sort of boundaries and tends to be quite good, whereas the Turing test is only looking at 2D slices. Do you think that might explain sort of some of the difference we've seen between Radboud and Groningen that isn't observed in the Turing test?
Yeah, I think indeed that we would have to devise an extended Turing test to look into this binning issue that we found. Yeah, obviously you select the slices randomly for the Turing test, and probably there will be more slices in the region where there's more overlap found. Yep. So yeah, we could look into that indeed to specifically select more slices at ROI boundaries to see what the results are. Then would be a good idea, I think.
And that difference in extent might be something that we're not capturing in the quantitative results as well, in the sense that if Radboud or Groningen contour an organ to a different level, it's perhaps invisible in the sort of analysis we've done at the moment.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. This paper was invited following your ESTRO abstract for the special edition of FIRO, following on from ESTRO, which meant it was very time constrained in production. Is there anything that you would have liked to have done if you were sitting down to make this as a paper from the outset without that time constraint? What else would you like to explore?
Yeah, sure. Not only one thing, but we have a whole list of things that we would have liked to have done otherwise. I think for me as a physicist, I would have liked to include more geometric and also time evaluation measures. So maybe added path length or time evaluation of contours or dosimetric measures to see what the effect is on that part. And I think also it would have been really nice if we could have exchanged data with Groningen from Nijmegen, have those contoured and by the observers and also by the model, and then see what extend the subjective evaluation with that to have a bit more insight in the factors that play a role in that Turing test.
Yeah, so that's the subjective evaluation. you had Radboud observers judging the Groningen contours, but we didn't do the reverse, which might have told us, as I speculated, that the Groningen people are just more accepting, and no, it's the other way around. Radboud people are more accepting, the Groningen people are more judgmental, or maybe it would have probably led to more questions for us.
Yeah, probably. It's always the case, but it would have been nice to see the results, and I guess we're going to do that in the future, but not for this paper.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for discussing it with me today. And yeah, hopefully we'll get to follow up on this paper in the future with those further work.
Thank you for the invitation and a nice interview.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
So, is a single deep learning contouring model acceptable? This study suggests certainly there are differences between institutions, and that a model trained at one institution may be less acceptable to another institution. However, the study itself doesn't fully explain where this difference of acceptance comes from. It may not be the differences in interpretation in guidelines, but maybe something more to do with the data acquisition. Therefore, it might suggest that it's more beneficial to train a model per institution to maximize the efficiency gain by any individual institution. However, this has its downsides too. The purpose of the International Consensus Guidelines is to improve consistency between institutions to make sure that the patients are getting the same treatment regardless of where they're treated. If we train individual models per institution, we would reinforce any differences between institutions. They would contour more to their own standard rather than to the international standard. And therefore, perhaps a single model, whilst initially less acceptable, might be beneficial in terms of improving consensus between different institutions. And as Ellen alluded to, some of the differences we see may have just been a factor in the unfamiliarity of the Radboud observers with that approach to auto-contouring compared to those of Groningen. So it'd be interesting to repeat this study in a year or two's time after they've got more familiar with the deep learning contouring to see if those differences between the institutions still exist. Thanks for listening. As ever, please do leave comments, and I hope you'll join me again for another auto-contouring